morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. We might start the conversation today. I know as we start talking, people will dribble in, so we'll start slow before we kick off the panel. I'd like you to thank you all for joining this important conversation, which forms part of our support and advocacy for the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence, which is currently ongoing. We are in the middle of the 16 days, and today we're going to be talking about advancing best practices in domestic abuse support. My name is Bridget Hancock. I'm a Senior Field Security Officer at UNHCR, and part of my role is to support colleagues within the organisation that might be affected by violence or security incidents. And today I'm joined by my colleague.
Yes, hello, good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Veran Bresson. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm working with UNHCR, part of the psychosocial wellbeing unit, and I am a mental health and wellbeing specialist. Our unit is working closely with colleagues from security to support colleagues in the organization who might face different types of violence. Nice to be with you all today.
And today we're joined by a very exciting expert panel of speakers. So I'd like to introduce them one by one. We have Liz Roberts, who's the CEO, Chief Executive Officer for Safe Horizon, and you'll learn all about Safe Horizon soon. We have Evelyn Latio, Policy Specialist, Prevention for Violence Against Women at UN Women. Thank you, Evelyn, for joining us today from Nairobi, all around the world. We have Gamu Gamu, who is the coordinator of the Global Domestic Abuse Prevention Program for the World Bank Group. And we have Charlotte Demars, who's a regional security advisor for UNICEF, the UN Agency for Children. Over to you, Veran.
Yes. So before we start the discussion, just a few points that are really important for us, that will be discussed today. First of all, domestic abuse is a topic that is more and more talking about, and I think the visibility is really an important step forward. At the same time, we can see data shows a rising number of violence against persons of all genders, but in particular women. So speaking about it is important, and really speaking openly about domestic abuse. So it means its existence, its forms, its impact, and it can really help people who are survivors in this situation and everybody who might not know yet, but facing, similar type of situation. Also, certainly to feel less alone in the situation. In today's discussion, we are going to also try to speak about resources and support system in place in different organizations, different countries. Also having in mind that every situation is unique and also complex. And depending on the countries where you live, it might be different type of responses, but it's something also we will discuss and address today.
I think this comes at the perfect time to kind of increase visibility on the issue around gender-based violence in general. According to the World Health Organization, over 840 million women, nearly 1 in 3 globally, have experienced some form of violence, whether it's physical or sexual violence, during their lifetime. And in the past 12 months alone, 316 million women have actually been subject to intimate partner violence, which is one form of domestic abuse. Today's discussion will be moderated by Veran and I. We'll try our best to keep the conversation flowing. And within UNHCR, as Veran mentioned, we jointly manage support to colleagues affected by domestic abuse together. Today's session is open to everybody, both UN people and also outside the world. And the whole idea of today's conversation is to raise awareness, but also to share some best practices among us. So firstly, I'd like to turn to UN Women and Evelyn, if I may. UN Women is the gender equality organization for the UN, Evelyn. As a subject matter expert on ending violence against women, what do you see as a good practice to effectively address violence against women? And what is data telling us as pertains to progress?
Thank you very much, Bridget. Can everybody hear me loud and clear? All right. And so I will just go straight into the conversation. You have set the context by sharing some of the data that is coming through. What I want to start by saying is that we have seen the figure 1 in 3 women experiencing violence in their lifetime for almost 2 decades. And from just the recently released IPV estimates, we still are at the same number. So I think we need to start asking ourselves some critical questions around why those numbers start to or continue to stagnate as we see. We also have seen the statistics around femicide of 1 woman being killed every 10 minutes. So by the time we finish this conversation, we'll have about 9, 10 women that would have died, in the hands of somebody that they know, most probably an intimate partner in that case. But I want to address this question, and I'm trying to share my slide because I like to try and hold our attention. Sometimes, with all these visual engagements, it's very easy to get lost. Can you see my slide? So I won't speak to everything on the slide, but just as I speak, I thought I could hold your attention there. We will be talking about domestic abuse, and a lot of people later on will speak about, practices that work and frameworks that we need to use to be able to provide survivor-centered, trauma-informed services to survivors of domestic violence. But before we hone down specifically on service provision and working with domestic violence survivors, I wanted to speak very broadly about what we see as UN Women, but also what we are beginning to learn from global evidence in terms of what works to really end violence against women and girls. And what I'm showing here is a framework that we use at UN Women, but it's a framework that if you look at how the What Works program is documenting as good practice, it's a framework that we see informed how we design Spotlight program, that for us to end violence against women, we need to be able to have in place laws and policies. We need to strengthen prevention measures so that we address the root causes of violence. We need to enhance response services. And you can see what we'll be talking about later on. We need to have data, and you started citing some data and the need for us to use it to inform our programming, both at prevalence level, but also at administrative level data, but also broadly, we need to organize communities, particularly women's rights organizations. And that way we can be able to have a very holistic and integrated, what we are calling a whole of government approach to ending violence against women and girls. And I'm just showing there, some of the tools that we have, like the respect framework that we are quoting globally and using everywhere, but now deliberate effort to work in sports sector, to work in schools, to work in workplaces. And now that we are even talking about digital violence, we're saying it's not just workplaces, but the changing world of work, because work is no longer in a physical space. But for today's conversation, I want to focus really on how that looks like and why it is important to take on this holistic approach, what we are seeing from data. This year, we celebrated 30 years of Beijing Plus. And in celebrating Beijing at 30, we tried to take stock of progress that has been made in terms of addressing gender equality broadly, but also including violence against women, since it's one of the 12 areas of the platform for action. What did we see coming through? From 193 member states, we have more than 90% of member states reporting that they have adopted some measures to address violence against women. So excellent in terms of measures that have been adopted. I tried to pull very quickly some measures that may be of interest to us. What do we stand and what does it look like in terms of laws? We have very good 70% of all these countries have laws on domestic violence, laws on sexual violence, laws on trafficking. When we see how those laws are translated into policies, that's where then things start becoming murky. We see sexual violence, particularly across the board, not having the same level of investments as the other areas do have. And you look at prevention, still investment in sexual violence relatively low. Same for services. And so while there are measures out there, when we unpack those measures across a spectrum of types of violence, they start to look very differently. And again, I hope that starts to point to us in the areas where we need to grow. We are celebrating and not celebrating, we are commemorating 16 days with a focus on digital violence. A lot of countries still do not have data or are not specifically addressing digital violence. So we were not able to pull the data that's coming through there. But what was very interesting for me in this data, and that's where I'll stop with my first, discussion, because I know that we have other people that will, submit and augment this conversation, but I also come back later on talk about digital violence. What we are seeing is that when countries have laws and policies and progressive legislative environments, it has a ripple effect in their investment in other areas of work. And so now we are beginning to see the ecosystem beginning to work, because when you have laws and policies, there is the demand to institutionalize those. When you start institutionalizing those, there is the question we ask around prevention. When you start providing prevention services, we ask, where's the money? When you start to put the money, we start to say, what is the data starting to tell us? And so when we invest in a holistic and integrated approach to addressing violence against women and starting with strategic entry points, then we are beginning to start to see that those spiral. And so very quickly, you can see from the number of countries that have laws and policies, 163 of them had transitioned beyond just the laws and policies to collect data, to provide services, to ensure that awareness campaigns on prevention, are also invested in or become priority areas for government. So I want to end there by quickly saying that a holistic approach to, services, and then what we will need, even when we are specifically focusing on domestic abuse, is an environment, a coordinated ecosystem of different stakeholders all working at these different entry points so that we are able to address violence against women in all its manifestations. So I want to end there for this first segment of my conversation and hand back to you, Bridget. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. And I think this is forming a nice conversation in terms of this holistic and integrated approach. And we're talking at a very strategic governmental level now, but I'm interested to hand over to Varan and see if we can delve into kind of how we can get to an organizational level and support to individuals.
Yes, thank you, Bridget. And it's one of the points we really want to discuss. It's about, the approach, how to have the appropriate approach to support, to guide and to support individuals who might be in this situation, might be experiencing domestic abuse, because we know how difficult it is. It's very often, a situation where you are isolated and it's very coercive situation. So it's not easy, first of all, to recognize, maybe a situation where you are, but then also to seek, support in a safe manner. So I think you have really the right person, to discuss this point today. I'm going to turn to you, Liz. You are like CEO of Safe Horizon. And if you can maybe introduce for colleagues in UN, but also outside UN, if you can explain a little bit, what the organization is doing. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I'm so pleased to be here with all of you. So Safe Horizon is an NGO based in New York City. We've been around for nearly 50 years, and we serve survivors of all forms of violence, abuse, and exploitation, from intimate partner violence and child abuse to human trafficking and community violence. And so I think it puts us, both because we are here in New York City, where we literally work with survivors from every corner of the globe, and have an opportunity to really deliver services at a large scale. It puts us in a unique position to speak to what some of the best practices are. Over the years, what we have done is really listen to survivors and listen to communities about where the needs are, where the gaps are. And we've developed an array of services that includes a 24-hour hotline where anybody can call anonymously if they so choose to seek emergency support and information. Our emergency and transitional shelters for survivors of domestic violence and their children, our court-based services where we can really guide somebody through the process of seeking an order of protection or navigating a criminal case if there's been an arrest and charges brought. our counseling and safety planning programming in communities as well as in those more institutional settings, where we can help somebody think about their safety in a really creative and individualized way. We have advocates in police precincts throughout the city, which is really unique to New York City, to be able to provide that service right at the point where a police report is made, to help a survivor navigate, the aftermath of a crisis, and also really understand all their options and resources. And then what we find is that over time, many survivors need these kind of longer term supports around mental health treatment, really helping to, address trauma symptoms and heal from what they've experienced, around legal representation to address issues like custody, divorce, and, longer term orders of protection, and also financial empowerment to repair the harm that very often occurs in intimate partner violence to somebody's, work prospects, credit rating, and so forth. And so this array of services gives us a chance to meet survivors where they are in a really flexible and individualized way.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for the presentation of the organization in New York. In preparation to the panel, we discussed as well, about, the approaches, because I think you have, in terms of supporting, person who are coming to see you. So I think it would be interesting to hear from you if you can explain a bit, also your particular approaches to support the survivors.
Absolutely. So there are three main principles that guide our work with survivors. The first is a client-centered or survivor-centered approach. And what that means is that we approach each survivor as somebody who is the expert in their own life, and who has a complete right to self-determination. And we recognize that, the risks, the concerns, and the resources that each survivor brings to the table is different and unique. It's shaped by culture, it's shaped by their economic situation, it's shaped by their personal history with abuse, with loss. And so there's no one right path to safety. And I think sometimes folks who are not part of this field sort of assume it's straightforward. Well, you should go to a shelter. Well, you should get an order of protection. But it is never that simple. And we know that for many survivors, there are big trade-offs they make when they make decisions like that. And we know that violence tends to escalate. It tends to become more dangerous at the point that a survivor is making a decision to separate or to take some kind of action for their own safety. So we center the client's self-determination. We see ourselves as collaborators, not rescuers. And we treat every survivor with a tremendous amount of respect. The second principle is using trauma-informed practices that we have learned, in this field over many decades now. We understand much more about how trauma affects the body and mind, about the kinds of symptoms and reactions that survivors are likely to experience. And so, and we also understand that treating that as solely like a mental health issue that only a clinician can handle is really a mistake, that all of our staff can have core skills to help survivors cope with trauma and to understand the impact of trauma. And that also we need to support our staff around their own experiences with violence and their own experience of vicarious trauma, the long-term impact of really hearing hundreds and thousands of survivors' stories of abuse. So we implement evidence-based trauma-informed practices across all of our programs. And then the third principle is taking an anti-racist and intersectional approach to violence, recognizing that that racial disparities shape the experience, the risks, and the paths to safety for our clients. Most of our clients are people of color, and recognizing that there are many other aspects, whether somebody has an LGBTQ identity or is living with a disability or has a past history of homelessness, that all of those things will shape what a survivor considers a safe avenue forward, and what they expect from an experience from systems. And so if we don't show up with an understanding of that complexity and a curiosity about their experience and perspective, we really aren't able to help the survivors that we work with. So survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and anti-racist with a kind of an intersectional lens on what that means.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. And I think really, you pointed out the very important, element of victim-centered approach, and working with people, and, it's collaboration, and it's really for also people, taking the time, to find the best way to advance in the situation that is always, very complex, of course, but not, thinking that we can decide for people and finding, the right things to do, but really, following them, during this process, and it's a long process. Thank you very much, Liz, and I'm sure we'll have more questions, afterwards, about the approach. Over to you, Bridget.
Thank you. And I think the word, the sentence that will stick with me is collaborators, not saviors. And I think that's a really important message for us all to digest. And I'd like to turn to World Bank Group and GAMU, because you mentioned, Liz, support to staff themselves. And GAMU, your team support colleagues, but also their family members, I understand. So inside the UN, the World Bank definitely leads in terms of the most advanced program to support people affected by domestic abuse. And you do so through the program that you manage, the Domestic Abuse Prevention Program. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and its history and how it came to be?
Okay, so I think basically the creation of this program can be attributed to the amazing advocacy of the World Bank Family Network, which was a collection and still is a collection of the dependents, whether they're spouses or partners, of World Bank staff across the world. And basically, they managed to come together and relate their experiences, especially in terms of where they would have relocated to different countries, and were able to put together statements and evidence that showed the need for us to have a support mechanism that was dedicated to dealing with issues of domestic abuse. Whilst the bank previously had this network there as a means to maybe create a social base for the partners and the staff members and their families, this network then realized that there's more needed, especially to make sure that we look at the health and safety not only of the dependents, but also the staff. So 24 years ago, they managed to do a study and they brought it to the president of the World Bank at the time. And it was undeniable what they came with. And so from the president level downwards, there was a commitment to actually create a dedicated program, and one that would have funding and would exist as a means to ensure there's continuing support for anyone who requires the services for domestic abuse. So the program from there has developed into a model that we try to create at least a minimum package of what a survivor coming to us can get. The first thing is we provide free and confidential services that include counseling that's provided by a diverse group of counselors who sit outside of the World Bank Group. So they're contractors, but they deliver this support to anyone that we refer them to. The second aspect is we have a team of attorneys who provide legal consultation for the survivors as well. And we try and have a balance in those attorneys to make sure there's one that's dedicated with knowledge in the US, but also one with international experience. And once they have the initial consultation and identification of issues, what they then do is connect the client with a legal provider in country. Now, we recognize also that in terms of the issues that survivors face, a lot of them have financial limitations, whether they're staff or dependents. So the program also has a dedicated emergency fund mechanism, where we are able to dispense money depending on the need of the survivor to cater for basic emergency things like accommodation, the basics from day to day, and so on. And we then have a different fund in terms of legal fees. And so if a client requires a protection order, if they require child custody arrangements and they're going through a court process, we also have the funding available for them, and we pay that directly to attorneys in their specific jurisdiction. But I think one of the key elements of this program is that it's not standalone. We have created a referral pathway that allows both dependents and staff to also benefit from the expertise within the organization. And so if a dependent comes to us, for instance, and tells us that a staff member is abusing them, they don't have the financial means and so on, we work with HR. We are able to get them in touch with HR to understand what the salary and benefits for a staff member are. We're able to get them to security to see if there are any security arrangements that are available. We're able to connect them with the staff association. No, for staff, we connect them with staff association. And so it's a collective of people dedicated to ensuring that we maintain the best standard of health and well-being for any survivor, whether they are a dependent or a World Bank staff member. And so it's grown from that initial idea from the family network to be something that's embedded into the culture we have as an organization.
It's quite remarkable listening to how holistic it is and how it also includes families and dependents, and it's quite significant, certainly in this day and age, for us to have financial funds and to be able to support with basics like accommodation or fees of a attorney for a protection order. That's really quite amazing in the UN, and I think a one-off. What I'm interested to hear from you, we in UNHCR often face a barrier where we don't have direct contact necessarily with a family member. And so oftentimes the information that we would like to share with them that this support exists, right, is actually filtered through the staff member themselves, right? So how have you kind of overcome this, Gamo, and what have you learned in the World Bank?
Okay, so we've tried to approach this from multiple ways. So first of all, when a staff member joins the bank, HR in its communication with the individual for onboarding actually encourages a staff member who has a partner to invite the partner to the onboarding meeting. And in the onboarding meeting is the first time that we actually share information on the domestic abuse prevention program. So they get a full understanding of, okay, there's a program in place there. But of course, as you said, sometimes the staff members might not want to have this information available. So the other thing is, as the bank, ordinarily, we allow access to dependents to our facilities in the World Bank. So we have health services, for instance, that are available. If a dependent comes into our building, we also have the information on the DAP. It's available in bathrooms, it's available in our clinic. So there are different points in which the dependent can get the information. We dedicate a lot of our time to doing awareness building, because we realized that another powerful medium for people to know about the program is actually word of mouth. We do have a lot of dependents who come to us and say, I didn't know about the program until someone I met who's in the World Bank Family Network told me about the program. And so we do a lot of these awareness sessions with especially the World Bank Family Network, so that we can reach people and they pass along information about what we do. But I think the biggest advantage we have is the family network itself. because the fact that they are able to organize as spouses and families means that they are our closest link in terms of being able to access dependence. And so people can come to them, they refer the clients directly to us. We are able to go into their different forum and do activities with them. We are basically, I think they're the biggest partner that we have for the program. And so that's basically been our biggest advantage in being able to access any dependence.
Yeah, it sounds very, very helpful. And also just from a security perspective, the ability to share information through that channel is quite unique. Baran, I might pass over to you.
Yes, no, thank you. And thank you, Gamo. I was really thinking also how you can reach out to people widely in the organization, because very often it's really a question we have at UNHCR, how to make sure, like everybody, not only our staff, but also, employee, spouses, can also have information. So talking about experience of different organizations, I think I would like, to hear from you, Charlotte, about UNICEF, because also as UN organization, you have quite, a cohesive and holistic response to situation of domestic abuse. So if you can maybe share with us, some information and also practices experience at UNICEF.
Sure. I guess it's still a developing area for UNICEF. Hearing about World Bank's structure is pretty amazing. But I would say it's improved a lot. I know during COVID, one of our counsellors in New York, Penelope Cox, which some of you may know, really drove the pulling together of UNICEF's domestic violence toolkit. And that was an extremely practical, focused sort of encouraging holistic responses to supporting UNICEF personnel and dependents. So I think they'll give a link to it as well in afterwards. But I would say, I guess, in terms of practical things that I've learnt, certainly in terms of the response, I think someone mentioned it earlier as well, the role of not just security, of course, as the first responders, but encouraging the victim survivor to disclose to supervisors, and some of the other elements within the organisation that can help. Because to be honest, from the security side, yes, we can try and get them to a safe space. Yes, we can try and help with safety plans, with the police. But after that, we really need to hand off with referrals. There has been a change also. I see originally I've seen victim survivors very reluctant to seek support internally, I guess, because of wanting to keep confidentiality because of fears about effects on their employment, prospects, attitudes towards them in the workplace, this kind of thing. I have seen a shift in that as I think awareness has also increased. But yeah, like I said, encouraging victim survivors to reach out to some of those internal resources, particularly as that also gives them access to some of that more practical and financial support. So I can't approve paid leave, or I can't approve safe accommodation to be paid for a few nights, like emergency accommodation. And so at that point, it has to involve like often the head of office or the supervisor. So definitely encouraging that holistic response has been really critical, and I think has improved some of the experiences. I think another really interesting thing to say, I guess, from the security's perspective was I loved Liz's comment, like Bridget, that we're collaborators, not rescuers. And for security advisors, that is a really hard shift sometimes. It's a different kind of way of thinking because, yeah, I guess some of us are very focused on, okay, let's solve this problem. And instead, you've got to kind of put that active listening hat on. And it's, like I said, take that real mind shift. So I think probably the second part of what has been really important experience in UNICEF is the increasing the capacity of our security advisors as well, and knowledge on how to respond as well. And that has been, it's starting and getting better. But, you know, of course, as well, with experience, each situation, of course, is completely unique as well. And some of the questions that come to me, it's like, oh, okay, this one's new. But yeah, we're getting there, and it's developing further.
Thank you, Charlotte. And what you are saying also about the confidentiality, because very often, you know, at workplace, you know, staff can be a bit, you know, worried, you know, about what might be said to whom, you know, and possible repercussions. So it's certainly one of the questions, you know, to manage, you know, very carefully. And thinking about the victim-centered approach, you know, every step, you know, to be discussed, you know, with the survivor, you know, and to see how to manage. But also the need, you know, to involve a small team, because it's not, you know, the security colleague or only the staff counselor who can do some things, but often we need to involve, you know, maybe the supervisor, also to have some understanding and flexibility, or we need to involve HR, you know, for some financial aspect, because it's also one of the real, you know, element, you know, how to support someone. So it's always, I think, you know, this fine line, you know, to find, you know, between absolutely, you know, protecting confidentiality and, you know, in agreement with the survivor, you know, to see who is going to be involved in the situation to advance it. And it's certainly about, you know, the holistic approach, what we need to do in the organization, but in a very careful manner. So no, thank you for the example, and to say, you know, about the guidance, you know, as that has been established, I think in 2022 by UNICEF. It's really, you know, an excellent model and something we are looking at also at UNHCR. So thank you very much for that. Thinking also about the organization, and maybe I would like to ask again, you know, Gamu and Liz, you know, because you are two of the, you know, organization, you know, having maybe the longest experience in terms of responding and supporting victim and survivors, you know, of domestic abuse. So maybe if I would like to hear from you about, you know, good practices. Maybe you can recommend, you know, for other organization in terms of what, you know, we should pay attention to, in terms of what we need to put in place, thinking as well about the holistic approach.
Okay, I can start off. I think one of the most important parts of this is ensuring that we have the policy and procedures to recognize domestic abuse as a challenge that we need to address as organizations. And for us as a World Bank Group, one of the things, for instance, is we have a staff rule that explicitly states that a staff member needs to follow all their family responsibilities. So it's possible to take someone to ethics if they are not taking care of their family, if they're not providing as per a court order, for instance. There's actually an action that follows through to take accountability for they're not doing that. But also in terms of establishing the program itself, because I think it's important that we understand the importance of creating the structure of a program of this nature and clearly defining what it does, because it creates that I think the sense of longevity that's required, because it's so embedded into everything that the organization is doing. Another thing for me also is that this program is embedded in our Health and Safety Directorate, because we recognize that domestic abuse and its impact really relate to people's health and well-being. And so we take it as part of our commitment to the duty of care to deal with domestic abuse situations as they come. We take it as a part of our commitment to ensure that no one who is associated to the bank, whether they are staff or a dependent, feels they are alone when we've put them into a specific situation. So it's really important to be able to place a program of this nature in a place where it can get the support that it requires, and basically make sure that it's a justification for why we have this program in place. Lastly, I think there's a great advantage, and I think everyone has referenced this in some way, to making sure that this kind of a program has access to a multidisciplinary team. Because domestic abuse, as much as we are experts in the subject area, we need the support, the minds, the cooperation of so many different parts of our organizations. So we work with legal, we work with ethics, we have security, HR, staff association, and all of them have also come to such a level of expert knowledge about the topic that they aren't only people who help serve the survivor, but they're also allies and advocates to the rest of the organization on why it's important to have a dedicated program. So I think this is one of the practices for us that has really made a success for the program. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Gamu. I think, yeah, I will, turn to you, Liz, with some comments after.
Everything that Gamu said resonates for me. I think we've found that we really have to have robust policies and practices in-house to support survivors on our staff, and also to address situations where somebody on our staff may have committed violent acts. And that's something we've really worked hard to develop over the years. It includes looking at your organizational culture. It includes having those policies. It includes that multidisciplinary team. We call it our safety response team that handles individual situations. And I want to talk a little bit about survivor leadership, because that hasn't really come up yet in this panel. So in the United States, and I think around the world, organizations like Safe Horizon have been started because of the voices of survivors, and in many cases started by survivors. And I am a survivor of violence myself, and very much bring that experience to my work and my leadership at Safe Horizon. And one of the things that we have been looking at in recent years especially is how to make sure that survivor voices are centered when we're deciding what policies to advocate for, when we're looking at our own practices and how we can improve them. So not just at the individual level, respecting each individual survivor's point of view and journey, but also respecting survivors as leaders in the movement to end this kind of violence. And I think that is so critical. And I really appreciated, Evelyn, when you spoke to the need to support activism and women's rights organizations in order to make the kind of change we want to make at the country level. And then the other thing I've been thinking about as I've been listening to this conversation is what it is like for those of us who work directly with survivors day in and day out. And I'm guessing there are many people listening to this conversation who either are in that situation or know folks who do that work. And we know that, first of all, if you are yourself a survivor, as so many of us are, that working with other survivors, you have a lot to bring to them. You have a lot of insight and compassion and passion for the work that you bring because of your own experience. And hearing other survivor stories may really trigger your own memories and strong feelings, or it may at times be difficult to support a survivor whose choices are very different from the ones that you made or that you wish they would make. So we believe that anybody who's doing this work needs really thorough training on that client-centered approach, on what vicarious trauma is, and then really, really good supervision, regular, scheduled, compassionate, focused supervision that helps them to reflect on how they are bringing their self to the advocacy and counseling that they are doing, and where they get stuck, where they may fall out of that client-centered stance because of their own biases or values or experience or their trauma reactions. And so I think as we build programs and systems to respond to survivors, we have to always hold in mind the needs of those who are doing that work directly. And we have to build a culture that recognizes that so many of us do bring our own experiences with violence to this work, and it both motivates us and can create challenges. And we have to also recognize that we all bring our own biases, our own cultural perspectives, and that a big part of the work is to understand what you bring, and then to understand when you need to set something aside so you can really be there for the person in front of you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for, also another very important point, about, when, working with team survivors. Very often, it's people who are passionate and dedicated, and as you said, you really do, this type of work because we believe in what do we do. And we want to support, as much as we can, from individual or more, organizational approach. But it's really very important point, about to make sure as well, people can get, like, support, space, for exchanges, and also to be able to be informed about vicarious trauma, as you were saying. Thank you for this reminder, because I'm sure, in this call, we have certain, a lot of colleagues also supporting other colleagues as well. So it's also important to mention. And thank you, Gamu and Liz, because you really tried also to summarize, about really key elements, and it made me think about how, Evelyn, you started the session, about the holistic approach, and to start, from the top, about laws and policy, and to have a robust, structure, and based on that, we can continue. And it's also about creating, like activism, supporting, any, group, activism, about sense of community. And it's not only about the individual support, but also the collective aspect as well. We need to think about it. So, and the survivor leadership, what you were saying, Liz, very often it's true. We think about, individual perspective, and to make sure, it's like, of course, the survivor is at the center, but not only for the support, but also thinking about, the system in place, and to make sure we have also people with lived experience who can give us feedback in what we are putting in place to see if it's really the right thing and we go in the right direction. So thank you for this very important reminder, because sometimes we can be so much focused on, doing, something, and we need also to take some distance and to see who should be involved. So very rich information. I would like to continue, Evelyn, because you were starting also at the beginning talking a bit, and you said you will come back to it after, about the digital violence. And as we were saying about, data especially from UN Women, showing, something that it's very preoccupying, about the violence on different formats, but especially since a couple of years, the digital one. So if you can maybe help us to better understand, this unfortunately new type of violence, that more people are exposed to. Over to you, Evelyn. Evelyn, I think you are muted. We cannot hear you. You are mute.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem, you are back.
I'm back. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see, we can hear.
You can see, you can hear. All right,
Yes.
so thank you very much. So I think digital violence is the big conversation today, everywhere you're going. I have been in this work for the last almost 18 years, and I haven't had the buzz for 16 days as much as I have had this time. And everybody's telling us, you are speaking about something that, we are experiencing every day, colleagues are experiencing, and yet it a lot of times is intangible, it is trivialized, and sometimes you almost even, as the person experiencing it, think that you are imagining it, because it sort of can be very latent and hard to touch. But why are we talking about violence, digital violence this time? And what is it that we are beginning to see? I want to start by saying that this is relatively new, not too new, but because of the proliferation of digital platforms, the growth of the manosphere that we are beginning to see, and all the things, you know, that come with, and this started, I think, peaking really during COVID, when people were isolated and we sort of found ourselves working in digital spaces and all that. And so the first thing that we are seeing is that they are connections and between offline and online violence. So you can, for example, find intimate partner abuse moving from the offline into the online continuum. We might be able to see violence against women in political or leadership position, kind of like taking place both online and offline. But also what we see is that offline violence is has also its own dimensions that are quite different from the offline violence. So when you start looking at things like doxing, when you start looking at things like online harassment and cyberspace stalking and everything, is it's the way in which it happens is really, you know, very, very different. We also are seeing and hearing from people that with offline violence, you might have one or two or three or some groups of people that are attacking you that you're aware about. But when you're looking at digital violence, it's just a whole ecosystem out there. You don't know, you know, how it is coming to you, from who it is. Sometimes it's even coming from your next door neighbor, but it's just in the oblivion. And so it makes it very hard to protect yourself and to see. And once something goes online, it then becomes, it goes viral, and then it becomes very systematic, very targeted, and it can be replayed over and over. So for example, if you look at things like, you know, use of photos and all these kind of things that are happening. So the first thing, and I want to start by saying, is that violence, digital violence, is real. Its impact is real. People are killing themselves. People are, you know, going into hiding. People are experiencing all the traumas that they actually can experience when they are experiencing domestic violence that is offline. And so for us and for you that are direct service line providers, I think it is important to start interrogating and figuring out ways in which people can identify this kind of violence and feel safe to report it, and hopefully as a field we develop enough to give it, you know, the names and the manifestations that we want people to bring. I want to use my 2-3 minutes really to talk about the magnitude of the problem. We still, as I said, you know, don't have so much data. So country profiles like we have for intimate partner violence, for femicide, are still not yet there. But from the little that we have, at least we know that almost 50% of countries, you know, experience violence, report on digital violence. And of course, men can experience digital violence that is related to masculinities and all that, but just like offline violence, it has the face of a woman. It is, you know, all over, whether it is from our data we are seeing, whether it's in the Arab world, in Southern South Africa, in Latin America, all over the world, we see that. But we also are beginning to see that it particularly affects women that are in public spaces, women that have public looking features. So journalists, human rights defenders, women politicians have higher risk of experiencing violence. And we are beginning to see it as a form of backlash, you know, against gender equality, to start sort of discouraging people talking about some of these difficult things. I was in an event yesterday where women that are talking about climate justice now say the first form of violence they experience is digital, particularly because they're talking about difficult subjects that are out there that involve resources. And they're saying, you know, rightfully, as we put here, that it is a security risk. And how do we start to talk about it? So in terms of magnitude, it's a really big problem. We need more data in that area. But I think as direct service line providers, how do you start to identify, put it in our checklist, and see ways in which we can start addressing it? I won't belabor so much on that. From our data, only 27% of countries have specific data that addresses digital violence. And most times, even those that are reporting, they do something, it is integrated in broader areas. So someone has a question, they asked in a violence against women survey on cyber harassment, they had collecting data on demographic health, but in terms of like really addressing digital violence, it is one place where we still do not have enough data, but we also do not have enough measures to address it. And that's why we are hoping this year and beyond the 16 days of activism, we call attention to violence against women in the digital spaces and start to invest in that. What are we asking in terms of investment, and what are the areas we believe will move the pin when you're talking about digital violence? Legal reform. So we have all the domestic violence acts that exist, the children's acts that exist, and all this. But I think we now need to sort of start working towards review of those to be able to integrate some of the things that we are seeing around digital violence. Transparency, accountability, particularly from digital companies and tech companies that are out there. How do they control this space, and how do we be able to work with other stakeholders to make online spaces safe for women? Because whether it's online or offline, we want women to be able to be safe in, whichever area they engage. Survivor response, we've spoken a lot about this. How can we start becoming responsive to survivor needs, to also recognize that this is a new dichotomy of violence that we want to start talking about. Some women, and we are beginning to see it, are not very, literate when it comes to technology and use of even gadgets they have. I keep telling people that my children are always laughing at me because they say, I don't know how to use my iPhone. They're like, Mommy, you don't know how to take photos with this. We don't know why you carry this thing. So a lot of people get duped. They don't know how to use, they cannot identify, and all these kind of things. And so how do we, protect and increase digital literacy for women and girls? We are talking about tools that we can start to use to be able to address digital violence, including those that can address harmful masculinities. We're doing an interesting study, and preliminary data is shocking us in terms of what are some of the patterns, what are some of the tactics, what are some of the driving forces that actually influence men to use violence in the digital spaces. And one of them that really shocked me is that some men that we think are unable to speak, they are we think they are cowards, they are timid, they look the nice people outside, are actually the most dangerous. So the digital space gives them the confidence that they don't have in the offline spaces to do some of the things. So what I cannot tell you face to face, I am going to go behind the scenes to be able to do that. And so we are beginning to say, okay, with this information, how do we start to develop tools that can also help us to counter what is happening in the manosphere and create a community where we start to also work with men and boys online to be able to address violence against women. And of course, and for UN Women, as you can imagine, how do we work with women's rights organizations and feminist movements to champion and to, their voices, to create safety for them and to be able to help them shape what our response to digital violence is. And so very, very broadly, this is an area of work we hope we can continue to develop, to grow, to work with you all and perhaps strengthen the response to digital violence, just like we are doing with other types of violence. So I want to step there and say thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. I don't know, so many questions, also what you are saying about about the last slides with the different recommendation, and thinking about how to use as well the digital tool to prevent such violence, what you are saying also about literacy for women and girls, and also what can be developed as, because it's existing tools, but how to use it differently, and also how to use it maybe for people to protect themselves of this situation. So no question that it's really a topic of now, but topic for the future as well. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very useful.
No, Varan, you're completely right. And I think what was very interesting was we've circled back again to the importance of feminist movements and women's rights organizations, civil society, and the importance of survivor-led responses. And interesting that we don't yet have enough data on digital violence, like we don't have data on gender-based violence enough. So that's a recurring trend, irrespective of the form. You talked, Evelyn, about responsive systems to survivor needs, and I'm interested to kind of end the conversation, or at least this part of the conversation, with UNICEF, and to hear from them a little bit about their experience in supporting people who are affected by domestic abuse. Charlotte, what have you seen from your experience, and how can we kind of ground our Q&A conversation in the voices of survivors?
Okay, still in the digital space, I guess. Yeah, I've definitely seen an increase in this even over the last 5 years. It's been massive, and I guess I would put it into 3 different categories that I'm seeing it with UNICEF personnel. There are the personnel that are falling for the romance scams, and that is, I mean, it's a global phenomenon, but as you're probably aware, in Bangkok here, we're sort of the center of the scam centers surrounding Thailand. And this is where a lot of the trafficking is routed through as well. And so that's very much affecting personnel. And then the second part is staff targeted online, because very often it's our female comms communications colleagues and advocacy colleagues who are much more sort of outward facing and obviously visible. They've got their X accounts and Instagram and Facebook, and you can see the violence online is very much more, it's gendered and it's targeted at the women working in the organisation much more than, say, male colleagues in communications. I would say, though, of those 2 as well, it's interesting. It is definitely violence, and it is extremely traumatic, particularly with the scam side of things. There's often, threats to release intimate photos. I'm going to email your whole office this kind of photo or this kind of a thing. And interestingly, a lot of those cases have been referred to me through our regional staff counsellor. Again, emphasising the importance of working closely with our counsellors, but perhaps also emphasising that people aren't seeing it as a security issue primarily. But it can be. And I guess that would lead more to the domestic violence side of the digital violence. Again, it's not, I mean, of course they tip over into each other, but definitely, again, particularly with ex-partners, the revenge porn threats. And if that's happening, particularly in, say, a conservative culture, or where the legal framework does not support this kind of thing, or the cultural framework, then yeah, that can very much lead to violence, and staff being lynched and this kind of thing, or honour killings, this kind of a definite immediate risk to the security of staff. And then I would say there's also this category with the digital violence. This isn't so new. This has been around as long as the UN, but obviously with our international staff, particularly moving from country to country, when there is, it's very complex for custody of children, the legal frameworks, this kind of a thing. Even if the survivor has got away, the violence has continued through emails and threats over SMS or whatever communications medium. I would say, and this is not scientific at all, I see that more often where there may or may not have been physical violence in the partnership, but very, very often if there's been a coercive control element. that need to continue the violence and the contact and the, you know, and the control, I guess, through email or whatever it is. So yeah, and like I said, just the level of trauma that can come through any three of those is really devastating for these personnel that I've dealt with in each case. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. And I think this is really kind of rounding the conversation nicely to start a conversation on resources available and then also go to the Q&A. But I think a few things I'd like to kind of reinforce from what we've seen in UNHCR, certainly how the digital realm, and Evelyn, you touched on this, can move into the physical realm very quickly. And certainly irrespective of it being in the physical realm, it doesn't reduce the impact to colleagues and their families or personnel. And part of that is linked to of course, the trauma and the control and the coercive control, Charlotte, you mentioned. From our side, we've seen in domestic abuse cases that we've supported, you know, a lot of online stalking or tracking of movements or abusive text messages. And most recently, we had a situation where a person had cameras installed in their home and they had no idea about that until much later. So it's certainly morphing very much into the reality of an everyday response to violence against women and against families and domestic abuse more broadly. But certainly will be coming very, very soon to security officers, whether we're ready for it or not. Varan, I might turn to you and we might share some resources and then we can open up to Q&A. So colleagues and people online, please share any questions. We've had lots of great questions come in, but please share any questions for the panelists and we will make sure we get to them.
So colleagues, you know, during all the discussion, we have been putting on the chat, you know, different resources. So it's like different type of documentation, so you can have access to it from the different organization. So it's some, you know, guidance, it's some policies. Also, we have resources from UN Women, because you can check depending of the country where you are, you can have access to numbers to contact some organization. This type of number is not existing for every country, but you can have a look, you know, at the link, you know, we shared, you know, in the chat, and to see in your country, because I think it's important to have this information for yourself, you know, for anyone, you know, in order, you know, to advise, you know. And for Europe, there is one also global numbers that can be used, you know, for any country in Europe. This one, it's really talking about, you know, worldwide, and if you are within or outside UN. Maybe just saying for UNHCR, you know, you have today you have Bridget from security section and myself online. So if you have any question, again, if you have someone working at UNHCR, you can reach out to Bridget or myself, because we are the focal point for our respective unit for all questions related to domestic abuse.
So why don't we turn to Q&A? We'll start with some questions on how do we support people affected. So one of the questions we've received is, if I know someone affected by domestic abuse, how can I best support them? And I'll open this up to all of the panelists and let them jump in with their best words of wisdom.
I'll start it off if that's okay. I did
Wonderful.
put a resource in the chat about supporting somebody in your life who's experiencing abuse, and it has some great tips. So please, you know, check that out, download it. I think the first thing I would say is that when I've listened to survivors of intimate partner violence in particular, also child abuse, talk about their journey, the silence of their friends and family is one of the things that is very painful and very isolating. And so, you know, I think very often we're afraid to approach somebody that we think might be experiencing abuse because we're afraid that we're wrong, we're afraid they'll be offended, we're afraid to damage the friendship or the relationship. But when we take that approach of silence, we're actually leaving that person in isolation. And so I think, you know, the first thing is to kind of muster your courage, find a safe and confidential moment to speak with the person and express your concern. And, I think expressing it in a really non-judgmental way and being clear, so I noticed this, I noticed that. I'm worried about your safety. Are you okay? You want to lead with your concern for the person's safety and well-being. And then I think if the person is willing to talk with you, that, the first task is to be a really supportive, non-judgmental listener and to resist the urge you may have to find solutions right away. You're talking with somebody typically who has been living with this situation for months or years, maybe even decades. They've been coping, they've been managing. And they don't want you to rush in and tell them what to do. That will be alienating. And so really listening with respect and empathy, understanding what the person, how they've been coping, and then asking how you can help. And I think that, as a follow-up step, making sure that that person knows where they can access a confidential free hotline for support is critically important. I think the other thing I would add, and I'll turn it over to my amazing colleagues on the panel in a moment, is that sometimes the person will say, oh, no, 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 that's not happening, or you misunderstood, or I don't want to talk about that. They might get angry at you. And I think accepting that that's what they need to do right now to cope with the situation and making clear that you're available to talk anytime, that you're a resource, somebody they can trust. And they may be ready at a different time. They may need to think about it. And so, and not being put off if the person's response is, no, no, you got it wrong, you misunderstood.
Thank you, Liz. I think this is great advice, and I certainly think it's not unusual for colleagues also and people going through violence to want to maybe think about things and come back, Yeah, and I think we need to allow people the space to have that agency to determine their timeline and their choices, and that includes when they're ready to have a conversation about the experiences that they're facing. Did any other colleague want to add to any advice for someone who may be affected by domestic abuse, how someone can support them? Or I can turn to another question. Okay. So another question is around children. And so what can people who want to help within an organization or not within an organization do in a situation when they have reason to believe that the children may be in danger? This is a hard one. And I think it's very context and situation dependent.
Maybe I should jump in on that one.
Thank you, UNICEF.
Okay. Yeah, as Bridget was saying, it's very context dependent. It's also, but clearly being conscious of what is the context, try and get as much information as possible. Then if you're formulating a safety plan for that person, talk to them about including their children in that safety plan, and not just in terms of considering, the children's passports or clothing or things like that. Also ensuring that the children are also aware of perhaps how to use the phone if needed, or where, if you've got a safe room, for instance, or is it the bathroom, or what they should do in certain circumstances. They need to be involved in that as well in a really non-threatening kind of way. And a mother parent will know also how to sort of lead that communication potentially. And then there are, legal considerations as well. And then also supporting that parent in identifying perhaps what are the triggers and when there are real immediate security concerns. And of course, then it's about getting them to a safe environment. And when you're considering safe environments with children involved, you also need to kind of find a place that will be child friendly. So that will also mean things like not a tiny hotel room with nowhere to play, or a pool that is not safe, it doesn't have a fence or easily accessible, different things like that. I am trying to rush through to that section in the UNSMS Gender Manual, but maybe, Bridget, you can jump in for me while I check if I've said everything I needed to.
That is the definition of thrown to the wolves. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's kind of our practice, at least, to ensure that the family also, going back to what Liz says, also determines what's best for the children. There are cases where if there's imminent threat to life, to UN staff, and this is now only for UN staff or their families and dependents, then there are some provisions for us to breach confidentiality, to perhaps ring the police. But again, that's in the most extremist situations, and we hope that through regular conversations with colleagues and ensuring that we are a safe space ourselves to seek support, that they will come and ask for advice before it gets to the point where there is imminent threat to life. We often encourage people to bring their families to briefings. So to what Gamu mentioned earlier, we don't have a family network in UNHCR, but we often have colleagues working in family duty stations, and we want to meet the families. We want to make sure that they know we exist, at least security and well-being and medical and services that they may need. I'm conscious to perhaps turn to another question, and then we can come back. Charlotte, if you have any other tips on support to colleagues with children. But we have a question here in terms of what is the advice to victims of gender-based violence where the partners or spouse could be a UN employee? And I'm thinking, Gamu, you might have some ideas around this. What advice could you give to people who are maybe the spouse of a UN staff member?
I think, and I hope that the others can come in as well. I think from experience, there are mechanisms in which the spouses can approach the organizations if they have difficult situations they're facing, if they're experiencing domestic abuse. A lot of the times you can contact colleagues in HR and security, and they are part of the referral pathway that can then advance you to specific focal points that can then provide you with support. I know, for instance, we have a dedicated helpline, we have a dedicated email, and I'm sure other organizations might have the same kind of systems to ensure that as much as possible, a spouse can get that contact. And once they get that contact, they can start getting the support that they require and be directed to an office that will treat them in a way that takes into consideration their experience and has their best interests at heart. So yeah, that's what I can say on that.
Thank you. Did anyone want to add? Charlotte, please.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, particularly as I think Bridget mentioned it before, that often we won't have access to the dependents as much as the staff member. And so even confirming their consent and their wishes can sometimes be really difficult. But when it does come to our attention, the UNICEF approach at the moment, again, is quite difficult and requires a lot of trust because it is against our rules. It is misconduct. And so we do say to report it to OIAI, the investigations. But I can say, though, that often OIAI will work closely with security to sort of discuss what kind of impact that might have on the safety of the dependent. They're not going to do things or very carefully consider things. They're not going to put the person on leave, for example, and then they're stuck with, at home with the victim and survivor, with the perpetrator. So they'll make a lot of those considerations as well. I would say that those kind of reports are unfortunately only dealt with by 2 investigators in UNICEF, both wonderful women. And they very much seek the views of the victim before taking any recommendations or the investigation further. So it is still victim-led. Like I said, it requires a bit of trust in OIAI, but they are wonderful ladies. I know in UNICEF's case, we're going to be organising a session with OIAI on this topic, in fact, so that security can get to know what their processes and practices are better as well. Thanks.
Yeah, and making sure our processes don't create further harm. I think closing that loop. Absolutely. We have another question in the chat that's quite broad. You talked about a survivor or victim-centered approach. What does this look like in practice? Are there small things I can do to support a person affected?
I can share some examples, and I hope others will chime in as well. We have an approach at Safe Horizon where we really provide rigorous training for our staff about what a client-centered approach looks like, and it starts with the initial engagement. So one thing that we teach our staff to do is really echo the language of the survivor as they're talking about their situation. So if they're describing abuse by a boyfriend, then we will use the term boyfriend. We will not jump to call that person an offender or an abuser or a batterer. And that's just a very simple example when we, really reflect and respect the language that that survivor is using to describe their situation. It begins to build trust. And it begins to center their experience in how we move forward. The other thing we do is we really make sure that we understand why that person is reaching out to us today and what their primary concerns are before we move into any kind of problem-solving process or into presenting options. So we ask specifically what led you to reach out now? What is your biggest concern right now? And then focus on that. And sometimes the biggest concern may not be what we think it would be or what we think it should be. So the biggest concern might be, I'm afraid, that my partner's going to lose their job, reflecting on what people were just speaking to, or I'm afraid here in New York, I'm afraid they're going to be deported. And even though that person is hurting me, that's not what I want to see happen, because I want my children to have access to their parent, or because they're providing financial support or other reasons. And so centering kind of the survivor's primary concerns. And then as we present options, whether the option that we're presenting is, here's a resource for counseling, or here's how you might get an order of protection, or let's talk about shelter as a resource, emergency shelter. One of the things that we aim to do is to, talk about how that resource might be helpful, but also what might be some unintended consequences. And really also ask the survivor, what do you think might happen if you do this? So that we're always coming back to what their perspective is and what they think is most important. So obviously it's a longer conversation than that, but you asked for kind of some quick, concrete things, and those are some good examples of how we kind of develop our staff skills in taking a really client-centered approach. I would say, working on the use of non-judgmental language is another really important piece. And, I think one thing that can be difficult about that is that it may be tempting when somebody is experiencing abuse from an intimate partner to really jump in and talk about how bad that person is. And the challenge with that is that the survivor probably has very mixed feelings towards the person who's harming them. If they start to see us as somebody who hates that person, who doesn't see their good sides, then we may not be a good resource for them going forward as they work with their ambivalence, their, maybe love and loyalty towards that person, along with their fear and anger about what they've been doing. So, you can't be neutral about violence. You shouldn't be neutral about violence, but you should be neutral about the person as a whole, so that you make space for the survivor's perspective, which often has a lot of complicated feelings in it.
Mm. Thank you, Liz. That was really, really great reflections. And I've written quite a lot of notes for us to implement ourselves. I don't know if anyone wants to add to this element on survivor-centered approach.
Maybe Bridget to add, because part of the question as well was, are there small things I can do to support person affected? And without being a professional already, to be present for this person. And I think it's also really to take time and not to rush, as, Liz was saying, not to give advice, you should, you shouldn't, because it's complex situation, but to make sure there is someone for this person. So I really thinking it's really about being able to be there for the person and keep judgment for yourself, and really offering the space of listening, and also, of course, ensuring question about safety, because there's also one of the points, and maybe to see how to guide the person, but already, to be present, because again, not to forget that very often people are really isolated in this situation. So they start to open up about something. It's already a good sign in terms of trusting you to speak about the situation.
Yeah, they've already identified that you are a safe place for them for now. So keep that trust. So I think that wraps up our conversation today. I'm conscious of time. We have 4 minutes left. So Brad, I might pass over to you for a few final remarks, and then we will close the panel.
Thank you, Bridget, and really thank you for all the panelists, because I think it was really a very interesting, discussion from different perspectives, and not only about the support aspect, but really about, what we need to put in place in terms of systems. So just, a couple of points, about the holistic approach. Again, we started with you, Evelyn, and I think it was a very telling presentation on how we need to see things, and we need to make sure it's something systematic that it's put in place. The aspect as well of coordination. It's not only, one person, but whatever type of system, organization, NGOs, or even, I don't know more, like maybe domestic sector. It's really, maybe different people will need to be involved in the situation, and really question of, keeping the person at the center of the situation, and about the confidential aspect, but really seeing, where other resources might need, to be found. And last very important point, Liz, you said something about the survivor leadership. And I think it's so important, because we are talking about survivor and about the person in the situation, but really thinking how we need also to involve survivor in, making, changes, and thinking about how to improve, what we can offer and we can propose.
Yeah, and a few things from my side, I think, to dovetail on that, I think, Charlotte, you talked about the importance of seeing the whole family and ensuring that the children are obviously catered for in a response, and the work that UNICEF is doing around that. And linked to that, Gamu, you spoke about the value of espouses or a family network, or reaching communication, or having spaces that are accessible to families and spouses, and the extension of our family of staff. I think a couple of things that stuck with me from the conversation were collaborators, we're not saviors. I think that was really important, and also that this holistic and survivor-centered approach, but also this anti-racist intersectional approach. I think this is something that's at the core values, not just of UNHCR, but also the UN as a whole. And so how can we make sure that that's mainstreamed and really integrated into our response, but also to the staff that manage and support colleagues affected? So I wanted to thank everybody so much for today. I think it was a very interesting conversation for me, certainly, and for UNHCR. We hope it was useful for colleagues online. And please don't hesitate to reach out to the resources if you'd like to ask any questions. You're welcome as well to follow up with Varan and I if you have questions, and we can share the questions with panelists if you have specific questions. And then there are a lot of resources in the chat, both from Safe Horizons and also from the United Nations and World Bank, in case there are any additional resources or information that you need. So thank you very much. And we look forward to speaking to you again soon during the 16 days of activism. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you so
ladies.
much.
See you later. Bye.